Hi, Mihir. Welcome to Network Capital. So delighted to have you with us. Your book, The Untold Flipkart Story, Big Billion Startup, is absolutely gripping, but we'll come to that later. I'm really interested through this podcast in talking to experts who come from different fields and essentially translate their mental models in an accessible way to our thousands of subscribers around the world. So let's get started. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Thanks so much for having me here, Utkarsh. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've heard some of your podcasts before, and yeah, they're really interesting, and one can totally understand why the audio medium is picking up. It's because of comparing podcasts like these. A bit about myself. I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist with Mint, which is one of India's top financial dailies. I've been a journalist for about 11 years and from Bombay originally, but have been in Bangalore for most of my professional life. And Big Billion Startup is my first book. So yeah, that's a bit about myself.
How did you decide to become a journalist?
So interesting. So I was actually studying to become a chartered accountant in college. I was studying commerce, and my father is a chartered accountant, so he wanted me to do, the course like all CAs do with their kids. But after passing the first exam, I found the course really boring, so I gave that up, and I was looking for something to do, and I really like reading. And I was fascinated by newspapers. So that's pretty much how I decided to become a journalist.
And how did you get your first break?
So I studied I did my post-graduation at Xavier's in Bombay, and Xavier's has placements at the end of the course. It's a one-year course, and CNBC actually was one of the recruiters. So that's how. So I joined CNBC from Xavier's.
Right, and from then, 10 years of doing what you do, what's the one thing that hasn't changed in the industry, and what's one thing that you believe has changed so much that you can't recognize how journalism was 10 years, 11 years back, and from what it is today?
So interesting. Yeah. So one thing that hasn't changed is the volatility and the incessant pressure, because journalism especially. So I started working at a TV channel, and then I joined a wire service, and both had in TV channels and in wire services, speed is the most important thing. So when you're at work, there's this constant pressure to always be on as such. You really cannot even switch off for like more than a few minutes. So I think that is something which hasn't changed. I mean, after Reuters, I've been at Mint for more than 7 years, and I think that kind of constant pressure and this pressure to be always on hasn't changed at all. The one thing that has changed dramatically is how news is consumed, right? So back when I started 2008, internet wasn't really mainstream in India. It was only used by a very, very small number of people. There were no smartphones at that time. So now that you have everyone has a smartphone, especially in the urban areas, that has had a tremendous impact on the news business. And I think the pressures are being felt by journalists on an everyday basis. How do you kind of ensure that you stay relevant? How do you ensure that as an organization, like when the organization is trying to adjust and adapt to the internet, how do you contribute to that and still not lose your sanity? So I think that is one big change that has occurred in the journalism business.
Right. And at Mint, you focus on long-form journalism, right?
Yeah, over the past 1 year, since last December, I've been doing only features and long-form stories. Before that, I was a news reporter. I used to do long-form occasionally, but yeah, over the past 1 year, I've been focusing only on features and long-form stories.
So your latest book, The Untold Flipkart Story, tell us about the early days. Like, how did this book come into being? What was the thought process like? Did it originate from one of the pieces that you'd done or thought about?
Yeah, it's a mix of all these things. So in fact, I was approached by a publisher way back in 2015, about a book on startups, because in 2015, I don't know if you remember, but euphoria about startups was at its peak, and startup funding was at an all-time high. So generally, there was just so much interest in this space, and it's a very poorly understood space, by outsiders. So there was tremendous interest. But so at that time, I had thought of a Flipkart book because I'd been covering Flipkart. That was the main subject of my coverage even then. But I myself wasn't convinced about the idea because it wasn't sure where Flipkart would head and would end up, because at that time it was locked in a very serious war with Amazon and Snapdeal. So it wasn't clear who would emerge as a winner. It wasn't clear whether Flipkart would be the most dominant e-commerce firm in India, etc., etc. So that kind of died down. And then in 2018, the Walmart sale happened. So there was a definite end to the Flipkart story. So from the point of view of there being a conclusion, you had one. So it made complete sense to look at Flipkart then as a start to finish story. And from my point of view, I had been writing on Flipkart for more than 4 years by then, and I was kind of confident about my ability to do a Flipkart book because I'd written several long-form stories, hundreds of news articles on Flipkart. So I'd been following the company for more than 4 years. So both from the point of view of the story being compelling and my ability to deliver, a Flipkart book, there was both were kind of in place for me. So yeah, that's how the book came about. That's how I got thinking about it. And then it just happened because one of my acquaintances introduced me to a book agent, and he
a different one from the one who had approached you a few years back.
Correct. Yeah. So the person who had approached me was actually at a publishing house at that time. This acquaintance of mine introduced me to a book agent, and then he was super interested, in a Flipkart book, and I sent a proposal. Before I sent the proposal, it was supposed to be my colleague and I who were supposed to do the book together. My colleague at Mint, but that didn't work out because she couldn't kind of spare the time for this project. So then it was me, and I wrote up the proposal very quickly and sent it to my agent. And within a week of him pitching to publishers, it was very clear that we are going to get a book contract, because we got interest from 5 publishers, and everyone was super excited about this book. So that's how. And then there was an auction process, and I think by October or so, we had finalized...
October of 2000?
October of 2018.
Okay.
Last October.
Yeah.
So by then, we had kind of finalized, we had narrowed down on Pan Macmillan, and yeah, that's how the contract came about.
So Pan Macmillan and the other publishers, what aspect of the Flipkart story were they most interested in?
So I think more than an aspect, it was about Flipkart, because it is such a big brand. It is also by far India's biggest startup success story. So I think and the Bansals being entrepreneurial icons. So everything it just ticks every boxes in terms of it being a compelling story for any layperson. So I think it was more about what you just generally know about something rather than a specific aspect of it.
Right.
So I think that was the thing. It's Flipkart, it's big, let's do it.
And you have a very busy job with Mint, as you were explaining that you do long form features. Before that, you were a reporter. What was the process of writing this book like?
Right. So I started, I had submitted the proposal to my agent sometime at the end of July 2018. By early August, we knew that there is substantial interest. So I started immediately around just early August, second week of August.
So started how?
So I started, at that time, I had a very vague idea of, what the book should be like. So I started approaching people that I already knew, and who were key characters in the Flipkart story. So I started doing meetings for the book. And I think from August to December to November end, I was just reporting every day, collecting material, and then I started writing in December. that was actually one of the triggers for me to move to a new role, because I just kind of become bureau chief in Bangalore, and it was a really hectic job, so there was no way I was going to be able to do the two together. So I decided to move to this new role because by then I was super excited about the book, because the material that I was gathering, it just seemed so compelling, because before then I thought this is going to be like, say, kind of a straightforward business book, but within the first 2-3 months of reporting, it became clear that this is an insane story. So I was like really excited about the book, and that's when I decided to move to a new role so that I could give all my attention to this book. And then I started writing in December. The first 2 months it went really, really slowly. Originally I thought I would finish the book by March, but I think by mid-January or so I had not even finished. Like I think I'd finished about 2 chapters or something.
Which is what? 1,000 words? 2,000 words?
That is about 6,000 words.
6,000 words.
Yeah. So but the book ended up being 105,000 words.
Right.
So it's actually nothing, right? So I think it started. I started in November and December, and I was done by I think mid-June or so. At least the first draft was done by the 3rd week of June.
So at some point you must have accelerated the pace of your writing.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so again, over here, so one of the reasons that we had gone with PanMac over others was that I thought, my editor at PanMac, Teesta, she seemed like an excellent editor. So what happened was that I submitted the first 2-3 chapters after I was done. And so the first 2-3 chapters took the longest, because I was trying to find the right voice, the right tone. I wasn't sure initially about what kind of book I wanted it to be.
Yeah.
And then after I submitted the first 2-3 chapters to her, and she got back to me, that is when it became much more clear as to how the book should be, like what form should be in. Should it be a straightforward work of reportage? Should it be narrative nonfiction? So we decided to make it into a work of narrative nonfiction, and I think that. So it was after the first 2-3 chapters, and after I got feedback from her, that is when after that it was much more straightforward. So I think from say Feb to I would say mid-May, these 3.5 months, they were like, that's when I did most of the heavy lifting, because after that it was just about adding, filling up the gaps and making it read better and stuff like that. Yeah. But most of the actual writing work happened in these 3.5 months.
Yeah. Let's actually stay on that. So the first chapter starts way back, right? Their schooling, their college, their coaching institute, so on and so forth. How does a long-form reporter, how does anyone find out that level of research, what went on in a hostel room, the very funny names that people call each other? Right. How did you, what's the process of discovery?
Right, yeah, so that's actually...
And you actually put the name in the book. A lot of our non-Indian audience will not get it, but it's like a lot, you don't hear it in normal books.
Yeah. So again, I included these things for a reason, because part of the aim of the book is to also get inside the world, inside this world, So that also means bringing out the language of this world, how people talk to each other, what their personalities are like.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things are really formed, during your college years,
100%.
Especially in this world and for people who are in this world.
Yeah.
So, but one of the biggest challenges was actually to find any kind of written records of this time. So, which is why most of the report, the longest that the reporting work took was for the first 2-3 chapters.
I can imagine.
So I also went to Chandigarh to meet people from their school. And
that coaching class, you actually went there?
No, I went to their schools. So I went to St. Anne's and DPS.
I see.
So I met Sachin's school teacher, and so that was really fascinating, because I also wanted to get a sense of the city that they grew up in. Because Chandigarh is not a metro, is not a big city as such.
Yeah.
And both of them are from Chandigarh, and there's so many people who came from Chandigarh who are like big figures in the startup world now. Not just necessarily came from Chandigarh, but studied there at some point or another. So it was very important to get a sense of that, and of course their IIT Delhi days. Because IIT Delhi is really when their personalities are forged as such into what they become as adults.
Yeah, and all aspects of their personalities. Like you explain what they did
absolutely.
on a day-to-day basis, how remarkable or unremarkable they were in college.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that I learned over there was, this kind of paradoxical thing, So when you get into an IIT, especially if you get into the computer science course at the IIT, you think,
you think highly of yourself, for the lack
very
of better
highly
words.
of yourself. But then, when you go to college, when you actually do your course, most people just tend to be completely humbled by the experience because, they think, they are the best at whatever they do, but then they find at IIT that there's there are so many people who are better than them in almost everything that they do. So, it kind of humbles them. But at the end of it, if you kind of come out and if you graduate, you still have that basic self-confidence, and you are filled with this kind of weird self-confidence and insecurity because you are desperate to prove yourself. Your deficiencies are also become very clear to you because you've been so humbled in college. So it's a very weird mix. So a lot of people who actually do not do that well in college, they tend to be among the most driven people, and they tend to be like people who
then I have to prove it to the world.
Exactly, they have a point to prove, and they try harder than say people who would be like toppers or something. So these are things that you only find out by speaking to people over there, because there are no written records of this. You can't find written records of things like these.
Because when I read that first few pages, of course I was laughing with the terms mentioned, but also I was amazed by how did Mihir actually get to know what happened in a hostel room like many years back. I thought maybe he imagined it, but it turns out that it's narrative non-fiction.
Right.
Yeah?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything in this book is
it's backed up by research.
Yeah, and it's fact. And it's not something that I've made up or even like. Say like added masala to it or something. It's nothing is like that. Everything in the book is stuff that I have been told by people who witnessed it.
Right.
So it's as simple as that. I have not included anything in the book that hasn't come from a direct source.
And that was a conscious choice.
Absolutely. Because
to not embellish it.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, for me, it became a question of trying to I had to exclude a lot of stuff that was very masaledar and that was very kind of scandalous, because it just seemed like it's going to add masala to the book for the sake of it. It did not really add to the narrative. But it is weird that in this story, in fact in most stories, people imagine that the writer or the journalist has added masala to make it more interesting. But over here it was the other way around. Like I had to consciously avoid including some masaledar or scandalous stuff because it would have just brought scandal and nothing.
Made the book less serious.
Yeah, made the book less serious and also not added anything to the narrative of the book, because at the end of the day, it's an attempt to be a serious book, to produce a serious book. So there are certain themes that are important in this book. So when you go by these themes, the scandalous stuff and all, it would have really not added anything. It would have just made the book masaledar. But the challenge in those years, the book starts from Amazon India, where the Bansals worked. So both the Amazon India time and their IIT time, there are no written records. There are very, very few written records of this period. So this is where I had to speak to the most number of people to just make sure that I have
How
the right
does one
stuff.
go about finding these people? Because you mentioned the locality where they used to stay and what was it look like, where did they hang out?
Right.
So I think that's where your training as a journalist would be super handy, I reckon.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's just about, I would start with people I know. they would, mention certain names, they would talk of certain places. I would ask them to introduce me to these people that they spoke about. Then, you just keep building on it. Then, you meet someone new. Then that person gives you some really new and interesting information. They, bring out more names. You ask them to connect you to them. And so it's a lot of networking that's required. Especially for this period, because again, this is not a period that I myself saw, because the last 4 years of Flipkart, I was covering it on a day-to-day basis, so I knew all the major characters. So in terms of knowing them and having access to them, and also having access to information, that was far easier. The real difficult period to track was like this, the first 2-3 chapters of the book.
Yeah. In this process of reaching out to this larger network in or associated with Flipkart, did you get any pushback? If yes, what kind? And what kind of support, if any, did you get from people? Was some people really excited that you were trying to go 2 levels deeper?
Yeah, I think a few people were excited, but not many, because Flipkart is a very, there are a lot of controversial things that happened in the last few years of Flipkart.
Yeah.
And given the kind of stories that I had written on Flipkart before, I mean, everyone...
Do you want to give a sense of it? Everyone may or may not have read those stories.
Sure. So basically, stuff like how Sachin Bansal's exit came about. He was forced out of the company, and it was a very ugly chain of events. So I'd written about that
and covered extensively in the book as well.
Exactly, it's in the book, and it's in far greater detail in the book, and there's a lot of new things in the book. But even before that, I had written about it, for Mint, as per whatever the format allows. So given that people who knew me already had a sense of what kind of a book this is going to be, or at least what kind of a reporter I am, they knew that it's going to be a controversial book. So there was from that point of view, there was very little support as such, because, I mean, obviously...
They knew it will not be in a shining report. Or
Exactly. So they knew that it's going to be a, balance account that will reflect what has happened at Flipkart and what happened at Flipkart.
Well, you're a journalist. It's your job to push the boundaries.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, some of the feedback, that I've gotten, from people inside Flipkart or, certain people is that, there's a quote-unquote negative, portrayal of certain people. So my, view on that is that I don't look at it as a negative or a positive portrayal. For me, it's the most important thing to bring out the truth, to bring out what happened. And if that ends up being negative or if that ends up being positive, then, it's
a byproduct.
Exactly. And it's an outcome of something. It's not really, what you start off with, or what you even consciously try to bring out or not bring out. You want to bring out what happened. You want to bring out the truth. And some people obviously would have fared well because of certain events. Some people wouldn't have. That is just how it is. So for me, this whole positive negative thing, it doesn't really kind of affect me in any way.
Got it. In the book, you in most business books, things like caste, politics, architecture, these things are not covered. But I wouldn't say you go into too much detail, but you do touch upon the notion of caste, the notion of politics, and even architecture. So I want to discuss caste and politics. Why did you decide to include it? Do you think there's actually a correlation?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, I was, listening to one of your podcasts with a historian. And
Manu Pillai.
Yeah, and, he was talking about how people in history, historical figures, they're also people. They are also, they also have things like anger, lust, greed, etc., right? So I think it's the same with businessmen. It's if caste is a factor, if politics do play a role in society, it cannot be that businesses exist outside of this. These things do play a role, especially caste, because as I mentioned in the book, the Banya caste is responsible for a majority of successful entrepreneurs in India, and the evidence is just you cannot come to any other conclusion apart from this after looking at the evidence. So for me, it was also important to bring this aspect into the book because it does play an important role, and it doesn't get talked about because again, there's one phenomena that I refer to in the book called the creation myth, and all internet entrepreneurs have their own creation myths. No one wants to talk about caste, whereas caste actually plays a really, really important role. I mean, even in Flipkart's case, the fact that Sachin came from a business family, like the conditioning, first of all, helped a lot. Secondly,
his father was supportive.
Exactly, his father.
A lot of people from other middle class backgrounds will not find such parents.
Exactly, I mean, there's again, the thing about the third co-founder, which. Yeah. Whose parents were really not supportive. Yeah. And in Sachin's case, not only was his father supportive, but he also provided a lot of practical help in the early years. And if his father hadn't, done these things, like it would have taken far longer for them to say, get as simple a thing as a payment gateway, so and the site just would not have gotten off the ground, and whether that would have crippled their ambition or not is an open question. But these are important things to bring out, and again, this is one of the examples of why we've called it the Untold Flipkart Story, because these things are not in like when you talk about the Flipkart story as such, no one talks about these aspects. In terms of the politics of it, I think. What was interesting to me was, that like when say Sachin and Binny and their IIT classmates they started working. That was really they started working at a time when India was just when it was India's best economic period. So their idea of like just their optimism about things is far higher than someone who would have entered a working life in say in the 80s or the 90s. So I think that definitely plays a very important role, just in terms of like the outlook that you have. And even in 2014, when Flipkart really became like the big company that we know it as, it was really after that 1 billion funding round. Over there as well, after the BJP government was elected into power, again, there was this big hope that, India's time has come and India is now, going to fulfill its potential and become a superpower or whatever. So I think, again, these things I don't think are, I mean, there's a connection between, these things, like the funding boom in India, the startup funding boom. I'm not saying it was, entirely because of, the broader kind of economic
macro trends.
Yeah, but certainly they played a role. So I think that is something that should be highlighted. And again, in 2016, when Sachin called for this kind of protectionism and all that, again, the mood in the country had turned towards that kind of thing because demonetization had just happened, and there was this like whole nationalist fervor. So I mean, it's important to kind of bring out that businesses are shaped to some extent by forces that are beyond their control.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there is some research that says that the most accurate factor that predicts the success of a business is timing.
Right.
And in this case, I'm not saying that timing worked very well for them, but there is a correlation that your book explores.
Oh, absolutely. No, you're completely right. In fact, I would say that timing was a crucial factor in Flipkart's success because I mean, e-commerce had been tried in India before Flipkart. There were a bunch of e-commerce companies that came up in the late 90s around the time of the first dot-com boom. But they collapsed simply because the macro trends just did not allow for internet businesses, did not allow for e-commerce businesses. There were not enough numbers of people using the internet. There were not enough numbers of people who would trust buying something online simply because the internet was so new. But by the time they started, an e-commerce company, internet penetration was far more than what it was in the 90s. People had used the internet for a while. Of course, the trust factor was very, very low even then. But that is what, Sachin and Binny really figured out. They knew that, if they get people to trust Flipkart to deliver stuff to them that they've ordered. It's as simple as that, which most e-commerce companies do not do. If they can overcome the lack of trust, then they have the customers. Yeah. And then once they have the customers, they can sell all kinds of things to them. So I think these macro factors definitely did play a big role. Even in 2014-15, this is when again internet usage in India went mainstream because of internet consumption on smartphones. It is very difficult to believe that Flipkart would have become this massive company if it wasn't for these macro trends.
Personalities play a huge role, and you, without embellishing, you go into great details: investors, entrepreneurs, employees. In the process of creating these characters, what was the most challenging part and what was most exciting as a writer?
I think what was the most challenging was that I did not have access to Sachin and Vinny for the book. So they declined to
you talk about it in the end as well.
Exactly.
Not even one interview, right?
Yeah, so they did not, participate.
Why do you
all.
think that is the case? Because I don't think you barrage them saying that they're all evil.
Yeah, no, I don't.
It's if anything, you just go into details explaining why they did what they did, and some of it, or a lot of it, is positive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So, when I started working on the book, I was assuming that they would not participate. Again, it has a lot to do with the kind of stories that I had done, while reporting on Flipkart for Mint, and because of the fact of their extremely controversial departures from Flipkart. I mean, when a co-founder is forced to leave their company, it is a very, very big deal. It is a very, very, ugly situation. So given the controversial nature of their exits from Flipkart, I was assuming that they would not, participate because, and obviously, they would also have non-disclosure agreements, etc., etc. So it was highly unlikely, that they would participate. But in terms of the most challenging aspect of, writing about them, of course, the lack of access was a big hindrance. I think the other was, just trying to put myself in their shoes and trying to narrate the story as it happened, rather than looking at it in hindsight and saying, oh, what, they did this because this happened. Because what happened was really an outcome of what they did, and what they did was driven by what they were feeling at that moment. So it was obviously challenging for me to put myself in their shoes. Of course, all this is based on reporting and what the material that I was gathering. But without access to them, to actually, kind of empathize with them, to understand why were they doing certain things that they did, I think that was definitely challenging. And that was also the most interesting aspect of, writing about them. Because once you empathize, with the people that you're writing about, it also becomes challenging because then you also try and put yourself in their shoes, and, you would imagine the kind of difficulties and troubles and ambitions and anxieties that they would have. So from that point of view, it does become extremely interesting because you then start looking at them as people rather than a CEO or some person you're writing about. So I think it was both interesting and challenging.
Yeah, and in the book there is in-depth coverage of the influence of the board, new rounds of funding, the new people hired in leadership positions as well. And especially these things will interfere with your empathy, yes or no? And if yes, how?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, look, the empathy only comes once you've gathered the material. Because gathering the material means speaking to a wide range of people who saw and, who participated in the Flipkart story. So once you gather that material, then of course, you have all these various points of view that are competing, and saying that, oh, look, there's one, facts are one thing, interpretation of facts is another. So obviously, everyone can agree on facts per se, but, what they mean is different. And, in Flipkart particularly, and that, this is also one of the most challenging things about the book, because this was a company where there were so many different individual agendas that were, driving the company and, that were kind of determining the course of events. So I think to understand, where an agenda started and ended, where it overlapped with another agenda. I think that was, again, one of the most interesting things and one of the most challenging things about producing the book, because I don't think there would be many companies like this where you would have so many, different camps, so many, just such a political kind of, atmosphere at the very top of the company. So just to kind of figure out, these things and then make sense of them, I think, it does, definitely it is challenging. And it does affect your, it does affect your understanding of events.
And I think because it does, you do a great job of translating the way you visualize the scenario to the book. Because, just like putting down the facts as you do, without the subtext would be less interesting, I feel.
Absolutely. So just getting that subtext, that was the most important thing, especially in the last 4-5 years. Because the facts of the last 4-5 years are pretty well established. There are written records of these things. So the facts as such, of course, it was a bit of a challenge to get, like some of the new details that I've uncovered in the book. But more than that, it was about understanding, why are these things happening. So I think getting the subtext, it was the most crucial thing. About, especially in the second half of the book, because it's not very clear in some cases as to why things were happening. Because say for instance, when Kalyan Krishnamurthy was brought in as CEO, and he was first brought in a kind of a vague role, but then
as
he was
a shadow board member in the company,
as a shadow, not a shadow, but as a
temporary hire in the company.
But in a very powerful role.
Yeah.
But then he delivered an excellent performance, and then he was rewarded for his role as CEO. So one would imagine that, that he's helped the company turn around. That would be something that the founders would approve of. But it turns out that they didn't, because he displaced them. So stuff like that, that seems very kind of obvious. It's not. So it was very important to get, the behind the scenes details and then to make sense of that.
Yeah. Did you manage to speak with the new CEO?
No. Flipkart declined to participate for the book.
Did you think it has anything to do with the Forbes story? That after that they became extra careful about who they speak to? So
that's interesting. The Forbes story definitely played a big role.
So for a lot of the listeners who may not know, there was one story that the founders thought would turn out to be positive, but it painted them as an extremely evil empire.
And, very unethical and, very toxic company. So certainly, I think, so that story was published in June or July of 2012. So I would say for the first 2 years after the story, certainly, they were very, very wary of, people that they would speak to, especially, journalists. But I don't think that had any role to play in terms of them deciding to not participate in this book. Because I think by then, by 2018, the Forbes story was really kind of it was not a...
It turned out to be wrong.
It turned out to be completely off.
And
not just in terms of the prediction, but also I think it was a very, very kind of, it was a bit of a caricature, really. It was not a accurate portrayal of how the company's culture was and how these people were. So I think that the Forbes story was, while it did have a massive impact at the time it was published, I think by 2018 it was not really anything in the scheme of things. So I don't think that had a role to play. But I would say certainly in the first 2 years after the story was published, it did play a very, very big role, not just in terms of how the founders perceived and interacted with journalists, but also just generally in terms of how or who they should trust and who they should not trust.
No, absolutely. When you spoke to the employees or stakeholders at Flipkart, which you I think spoke to hundreds.
Yeah.
Did you find them scared, afraid, excited, nervous, all of the above, none of the above? Or it varied?
It certainly varied. But there were a few. It's quite comical. There were a few things common in almost every interaction. So one thing was that almost everyone I spoke to who worked at Flipkart felt that they had done the best work of their careers over there, and they had the worst exits of their careers over there. They were very, very embittered by the time that they left Flipkart. And all of them, felt that their contribution was pivotal to the company. Without them, the company would have been nothing. And yet they were just completely discarded, without any kind of meaningful notice.
Yeah, some of the exits which you talk about in the book were quite unpleasant, I would say.
Absolutely. But, the interesting thing for me was, this company just managed to, create this kind of a culture where every employee thought that, they are just doing like some amazing work and, they are really valued and, the company won't run without them. So I think it's comical for me as an outsider to think that, anyone would think that, or everyone would think that their contributions were pivotal and without them, the company would have failed or, would have collapsed. But I think it does tell you about the kind of culture that the Bansals were able to,
Tell us
cultivate.
more, because the same thing is extremely positive, where some people or everyone thinks that without them there's no Flipkart, which means that they did do great work, as you
absolutely,
mentioned.
they did. I mean,
getting this is super hard for companies, by the way.
Exactly,
isn't it? Yeah.
right? I mean, like how many companies, I spoke to more than 100 Flipkart employees. That's a pretty large number. For most of them to think, that their contributions were pivotal and that they did the best work of their careers at Flipkart. I mean, that
is saying
does
something.
tell you, right, about the culture that the company was able to cultivate. So I think the culture.
The flip side is where I think the Game of Thrones as a reference comes in very handy.
Exactly, right? I mean, like you said, it's exactly like this, that was the flip side because, because everyone was so empowered or felt that they were empowered, obviously individual ambition also grows and, then it clashes with other individual ambitions. So, yeah.
I imagine you have watched Game of Thrones, right?
I have, yes.
You reference it in the book as well. Do you want to maybe draw a couple of parallels between, or some synergies between Game of Thrones and the Untold?
Sure. I'll just tell you what, I heard from Flipkart employees, right?
Yeah.
So basically, Game of Thrones is like, who will become king? Who will wield power? Over here, again, it was like, there were like mini Games of Thrones happening at various levels. So at various levels, it was like, no one really knew for sure. So even if, say, someone became a VP, no one really knew how long this person would last because there were just so many changes at Flipkart. And, these changes were not caused by, say, like things that, a normal person would understand in the sense that, say if someone was made a VP today, 3 months later that person would be out. And why that person was out was really not very, very clear on, like, say, all occasions. So I think because of this kind of uncertainty about, one's position at the company, especially at the top, especially at, say, the first 2-3 levels, I think there was this constant, insecurity that everyone over there felt. There was this constant, need to secure yourself, to secure your position. And obviously, one way to do that is to kind of put down your peers or, put down rivals. So, I mean, that's
very Game of Thrones-esque,
that is
right?
very, exactly, right? But I also think it's kind of a flawed analogy because I think over here at Flipkart, there was one man who wielded power. And that was Leaf Excel, who was the Flipkart board member and the Tiger Global managing director. So I think from that point of view, it was very clear that, while he did not run the company as such, but eventually he was the most powerful man over there.
Yeah.
And what he wanted influenced events in a very, very big way.
Even though he had an extremely close relationship, as you point out in the book, with Sachin Bansal.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's what I said, right? So it's not as if he was running the company. I mean, there was this, kind of perception in the startup world from, say, 2011 until 2016-17 that, Leaf Excel was running Flipkart. That is completely untrue. He's actually one of those investors who did not get involved in operations, who did not tell people what to do for most part of Flipkart. So from that point of view, certainly he was very, very supportive of, Sachin and Binny, for the most part. But when, Flipkart started losing ground, when Flipkart was in trouble, he really stepped in a big way. That's when he showed his ruthless side.
I think the move to send Kalyan was also...
Absolutely. It was completely orchestrated by Leaf Excel.
Yeah. Multiple times.
Not the first time as such. The first time actually, even the Flipkart founders were very, very in favor of bringing him on board because he was a finance expert and, their finance function was
struggling under the person they hired.
Exactly. It was in a mess and, they really needed to fix it because, while, as a startup, you can afford to kind of have loose controls or, not that, while you are not so focused on maintaining, these functions like legal and finance in a very, very kind of structured way. As you grow, you have to do that, otherwise, you're going to collapse. So I think they were very, very supportive of bringing him on board the first time he came in. Certainly not the second time. Second time he was really forced upon them in a way.
So when did things start going south? Because he came in, he delivered, which basically made the founders look good, I would imagine, to some people.
Yeah.
What was the key lesson there?
So I think it started going wrong in 2015 in a very, very big way. So until 2014, Flipkart was really by far the clear market leader. Snapdeal and Amazon were there, but they were not, running Flipkart close.
Also a very different business model, as you point out.
Sure. They did have different business models, but even if you look at the market overall,
right.
They were not really very close to Flipkart. Then I think Flipkart, again, just to go back a bit, so Sachin was like really the main man at Flipkart from the time it started in 2007 until the end of 2012. And then, there was the setback at the end of 2011 because of which, it really affected him and he kind of stepped back a bit and then he stepped back completely at the end of 2012. And then that's when Vinny took over. He was really running the company on a day-to-day basis. For the first time, without Sachin really. And, that was also the time when Kalyan was there. So basically this period from 2013 until the end of 14 was really like the Vinny and the Kalyan phase at Flipkart. And then, Sachin was very, very eager to get back into the game. He wanted to run things his way. And, he always thought of himself as his technologist.
And Flipkart as a technology company,
exactly.
Not an e-commerce company.
Absolutely. So he thought of Flipkart as a tech company, as a tech platform. That is, they're doing commerce, but it's really like technology that is driving it rather than sales or the sense of, just getting like some, achieving your numbers or something. So he really believed in the power of technology and he wanted to make Flipkart into a technology company. Whereas under Binny and Kalyan, Flipkart had become like a classic retail firm, that buys from distributors, wholesalers and brands, is very clever in knowing what to buy and then, sells stuff to customers and, just like doing that very, very efficiently and just growing your sales just by figuring out what should we sell to customers and just selling more and more goods to your existing customers and getting new customers.
Yeah.
So that's a very retail company mindset. Sachin, whereas, wanted to convert Flipkart into a tech company. So then he came back into the driver's seat again by the end of 2014. And
what was it, Flipkart 2.0 or 3.0?
Flipkart 3.0.
Yeah.
So the first spell of Flipkart, which was when Sachin was the main man, was Flipkart 1.0. Then the second, when Binny and Kalyan were
Flipkart
dominant,
2.0.
that was 2.0, and this would be 3.0, where Flipkart would really become the Alibaba of India. It would become this giant tech platform that facilitates commerce. So his idea was that Flipkart should not be selling anything directly to customers. Flipkart should, there are millions of retailers in India, and then Sachin believed that now India has that ecosystem of sellers and logistics companies, that if you can just connect logistics companies to sellers, and then you just connect customers to sellers on your platform, you just need to do that.
A bit like Snapdeal.
Exactly. That was quite funny. So,
and I love how much in depth you go in this Flipkart versus Snapdeal business models.
Right, exactly. So but there was one key difference. So Sachin's belief was that at the time that Flipkart started, there was really no e-commerce market in India. It was it was too insignificant to talk about. So Flipkart really had to do everything by itself. It had to sell goods directly because it wanted to sell original, genuine products to customers. And how do you get these products to customers? There was no ecosystem of logistics companies that were used to working, at a very, very in that fast and efficient manner that Flipkart wanted. So Flipkart really had to do all these things itself. But by 2014, he believed that because the e-commerce ecosystem in India had really developed over the past 7 years, and Flipkart had really led this development. He believed that now there are enough numbers of sellers, there are enough numbers of people buying online, and there are enough these suppliers like logistics companies and software providers, etc., that all Flipkart needs to do is just kind of integrate all these things by using its technology. So he really thought, that now the time has come to really be a marketplace model, so that India already has a massive retail market. So why try and do everything yourself?
And e-commerce is a very small part of it,
E-commerce
even today.
is a very small part of it, and one of the reasons that he believed was that because, e-commerce has largely developed through retail, in the sense that, the e-commerce companies that were large were buying and selling goods to customers. So obviously, if you do everything yourself, that limits your ability to grow. So his belief was that, why don't we just utilize the retailers that are already out there, but bring them online? So for instance, if I'm sitting in Bombay, in Santa Cruz West, I mean, there are, in my neighborhood, there would be at least, say 10 to 15 stores. So and they would have a lot of products. Of course, they would have their own products. So what Flipkart can do is aggregate all these products. So a customer in Santa Cruz West places an order. Rather than Flipkart delivering it from its warehouse, way out of Bombay or, on the outskirts of Bombay, why doesn't this Flipkart get stock, present stock of retailers in Santa Cruz that are already there, and then connect a logistics company in Bombay, a local logistics company, to the seller, who can just pick up the goods from the seller and deliver it to the person who's ordered it in Santa Cruz West.
Yeah.
So it was this, this really futuristic idea of this very hyper-local tech ecosystem.
Makes sense, right?
On paper,
Yes.
On paper, it makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
it's perfect, right? I mean, if you just listen to it, it's like, yeah, of course.
Super
it's
intuitive,
there. Yeah. But the problem is that, first of all, there was no, the logistics ecosystem in India was still very, very rudimentary. It was not, large enough. It was not efficient enough to support this kind of vision. In fact, that was one of the big lessons that Flipkart had figured out in its early years, and that's what they had tried to solve for, and they had succeeded in solving for that. But by 2015, while Sachin thought that now there is a very, very evolved ecosystem, that was just not true. Because we did not have the kind of sellers, the kind of product range, the kind of logistics service that you require to deliver what Sachin wanted. So while Flipkart tried to do this, its brand took a hit because all kinds of
the board also was not very kind to this.
Actually, the board was the board completely went with it in 2015, and until the end of 2015, they did not do anything. They let this play out. It was only at the end of 2015 when they saw that Flipkart's brand has taken a big hit, because all these e-commerce companies, they have this metric called NPS, which is Net Promoter Score, which is a metric that measures the customer satisfaction of a particular company. That metric was taking a big hit. Sales are not growing. New customers are not coming in droves anymore. All these things pointed to a very, very clear picture that the vision was flawed. Mm-hmm. We do not have that ecosystem of sellers and logistics companies that can deliver, Sachin's vision of this very futuristic technology platform.
Yeah.
And that is when the board stepped in, and that is when Leaf Excel was particularly brutal about getting his way.
Yeah. For the majority of Flipkart's tenure, Flipkart's origin or growth or whatever, the co-founders had excellent relationships.
Correct. So that was one of the most interesting things about tracking the story, because so when they started Flipkart, they were not really the best of friends. They had this group of 8 in the NGV apartment complex in Koramangala and Bangalore. So they were not the best of friends in that group, but they were the only 2 people who were very, very inclined towards internet entrepreneurship. And they both, because they saw Amazon, because they worked at Amazon, they saw how Amazon had become a massive company, especially Sachin. they wanted to do an e-commerce company in India. So I think they started off in this way, that they were more like very, very close business partners rather than very, very close personal friends. And then, of course, because Flipkart went through so much in its first 2 years. I mean, they came very close to shutting down. They came very close to selling out. They came very close to giving up. And they were kind of they faced a lot of like trouble, which most companies starting out would not, because they struggled to convince any of their friends and acquaintances to join them. All venture capital firms turned them down for the first 18 months. So that really did bring them closer, because they went through this troubled period together and they emerged out of it. So I think their close relationship was really forged in the first 2-3 years of Flipkart.
Yeah.
And until 2014, it was great. They were both, always on the same page about where they wanted to take Flipkart. Both of them wanted to, really like create a massive internet company in India. And then, in 2015, when Sachin attempted this radical transformation of Flipkart, it was not clear what Binny thought of it.
Yeah.
Of course, Binny went along with the vision, but
as he had many times in the past.
He had many times in the past, but this was a particularly radical, move by Sachin. To like just move from a technology company to try and become a technology company from a retailer. I mean,
so even by the standard of past pivots, you thought that this was
particular.
Oh,
absolutely. I mean,
even that $1 billion target seemed quite intense to me.
Absolutely, that was. But it was about the size of the ambition at that time. Over here, more than the size of the ambition, it was about how do we fulfill this ambition. So I think the problem really, was among them was really that Sachin wanted to reach this 100 billion goal in this way. Of course, the 100 billion goal itself was his own, target that he set for Flipkart, and that this is where he excelled, because he really could imagine the improbable and not imagine the improbable in a very, very casual or a thoughtless way, in a very, very serious way. And he was very, very sincere about achieving the targets that he had set, and he had the credibility, because he had set the 1 billion target in
and
2011 and achieved it far ahead of time, 1 year ahead of time. It was just incredible, right? So he had the credibility, he could see the future, and everyone knew that. But now, when he made this 100 billion target, and he set the blueprint for achieving it. I think the problem really was that the blueprint was so radical that while everyone went along with Sachin because he had the credibility, and Flipkart was really at its peak at that time in terms of everything, in fundraising, in terms of the market position, etc. I think a lot of people deep down were not convinced by it. They went along with it because here was Sachin, who had been proved to be a visionary. He's saying this, he has a credibility, he's a CEO, let's go with it. And I think through 2015, people inside Flipkart also weren't really sure what Binny made of it, because he never, publicly was a big proponent of this vision. He was always in the shadows when this vision was being, put into life. So it was not very clear what he made of it. And then at the end of 2015, when it was decided that Binny would become CEO, he really went a long way towards dismantling the vision in the next 5 months that he after he became CEO.
It's unclear whether their friendship still stood there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it is really not clear, because he also went out of his way to ensure that Sachin was not a part of the day-to-day activities at Flipkart, and that really surprised a lot of people who knew him, because he was always considered this.
The operations
guy, and also he was also kind of considered to be, I wouldn't say meek necessarily, but in terms of he would defer to Sachin. And here he was, after becoming CEO, just completely taking control, completely enjoying the limelight, putting Sachin, making sure that Sachin is now no longer associated with the day-to-day running of Flipkart. So the fact that he really came into his own when he became CEO, that surprised a lot of people, and that certainly had an impact on his relationship with Sachin. And then over the next 1 year, after Kalyan Krishnamurthy came into Flipkart, and then he was made CEO in January of 2017. Again, it was not clear, what the relationship was between Sachin and Binny. They were certainly not as close as they were, before all this started. And then, also because like Kalyan became CEO and Binny assented to it. Whereas Sachin's opinion wasn't even sought on the matter.
Yeah.
So Sachin was very, very angry about, this turn of events. And then, of course, at the end, what happened was that they fell apart, and Sachin, Binny did not support Sachin in his desire to return as CEO,
despite the multiple rounds of coaching, which is mentioned
exactly.
in the book.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things was that until the very end, they had almost always been on the same page about where they wanted to take Flipkart and about their roles inside the company. But then by the end, it had become clear that, for Sachin, the Walmart sale was a fresh start. Like, he looked at it as, okay, so Walmart is going to come in, they're going to become the majority investor, they're going to become the main investor, Tiger Global is not. And I'm, again, going to come back into the CEO's position or into the driver's seat, and I will, again, resume my pursuit of the 100 billion goal in the way that I want.
Yeah.
Whereas Binny saw the Walmart sale as a kind of gratifying end to their struggles. Like, they had been at it for, more than
12 years.
Yeah,
10
almost
years,
12 years. So he really saw it as the end. Now enough. Like, now I want to, I think Flipkart has reached its, conclusion as an independent company. We are getting a superb exit. I'm going to become a billionaire. I want to enjoy this. I want to savor the moment. Whereas again, Sachin was actually considering, and he had started talks to double his stake in Flipkart after the Walmart sale.
Yeah.
So,
literally putting his money where the mouth is.
Exactly. Right? So, these are completely disparate points of views. And I think this was one of the main reasons that they fell apart. The other was, of course, how they saw each other contributing to Flipkart. Like, again, Sachin thought that it was extremely important that he returned to the driver's seat at Flipkart because, to really become a massive internet company, Flipkart should do certain things that it wasn't. So he believed that he was key, he was indispensable to Flipkart. Whereas Binny did not. Binny did not think that Sachin was indispensable to Flipkart. Binny believed that, Sachin now should step back, he should just be chairman, he should be associated with the company, but he should not be running things. So that is, and Binny was very happy to leave Flipkart. So I think this difference of opinion, again, had a very, very big role to play.
Yeah. And again, we're coming to the close of the interview, but just a couple of more questions. Pure speculation. Do you know if there's any insight about their relationship today?
They are not on speaking terms. They are not on speaking terms.
The other speculation or suggestion, because you've studied this company in so much detail, many other Indian companies hopefully will do as well as they have. Do you have any suggestions for them to manage culture, to manage power struggles?
So honestly, I don't think I'm equipped to give
based on your,
right? But
yeah,
sure,
yeah.
Just about Flipkart, just going by Flipkart in terms of managing the culture. In many ways, the Flipkart culture was very, very positive and very, very empowering for its employees because, like we were discussing earlier, many of the Flipkart employees, especially in the first 4 to 5 years, felt that they had done the best work of their careers over there. And, that's a great feeling, right? I mean, everyone should obviously feel that, should have that kind of opportunity to really, discover how good they are and prove how good they are. So that was one very, positive aspect of the culture. But I think one of the really brutal aspects of the culture was that, Flipkart really discarded people far too easily. I mean, there was no attempt to integrate people. There was no attempt to, provide new skills to people who have proven themselves. But say if, there's this person who's working in the tech team, he's been a fantastic contributor, to your success for 2 years. But now because the company has, really reached a certain scale, you believe that he may not be able to deliver at that scale. Instead of trying to find a new role, or instead of trying to kind of educate them in terms of new skills, Flipkart just cut them loose. And it was really, really brutal. And in a way, if you look at Sachin and Binny's exits, they were consumed by this culture themselves at the end. So while it was very, very sad, but it was the culture that they had, created at the company. That once it becomes clear that you know what, like you are not so important, I'm done with you.
Yeah.
So I think you have to be mindful that, you know, there are more, like, while of course, you know, success is important, while scale, valuation, funding, all of that is important. I think in 2019, 2020, you cannot build a company that is just ruthless. You know, you have to have a certain humane aspect to your culture, which I think is very important, and which for me was one of the most striking things about Flipkart. That, you know, for a very long time, it had a very brutal culture at the top, at least, you know, at the top 2-3 levels. And I don't think that is necessarily a very, very positive thing, at least from an employee's perspective.
For the time you were writing this book, you were also doing pieces, long-form pieces for Mint.
Yeah.
How did you manage your schedules?
Yeah, that was very difficult. So I took a sabbatical of about 3 months, where I was only working on the book. And my publication was extremely supportive, you know, of this project. So yeah, so I can't thank them enough, and especially my editor. So yeah,
Your Mint editor.
The Mint editor, yeah.
Right.
So that was really, really nice of them. But yeah, for most of the time I was working on the book, I was also you know, doing Mint stories. So it was challenging, but I mean, it's just, you know, you just kind of it's just about discipline. So you decide that, you know, you're going to work for, say, you're going to do Mint work for, say, 7 to 8 hours a day, and you're going to do the book work for another 7 to 8 hours every day.
So it took you around 14 to 16 hours for a chunk of...
Oh yeah, absolutely. For most of the 1 year that I spent working on the book.
Yeah. Was it taxing? What did you do to sort of overcome the writer's block, if you believe in that at all?
So I think in non-fiction, at least, you know, I mean, I think the writer's block, while you know, a lesser kind of a lesser intensity. I mean, you may come across a writer's block of lesser intensity, but it is not so much of a big deal in non-fiction. So for me, it was certainly exhausting and it was taxing, but it was also like it also was very, very rewarding, because, you know, the kind of thing that that we were able to produce by the end, like, I was very happy with it, because I had not thought that, you know, we would be able to produce a book of this quality when I started out. So I think it was completely worth the effort. But yeah, it takes a lot of discipline. I mean, there's a lot of self-doubt, you know, in the process, a lot of kind of thinking that, you know, you're on the wrong track, you're going to be laughed at, etc., etc. So, you know, it's just about, like, a lot of times you have to trick yourself into thinking that, you know, you are making progress. So for instance, you know, there would be these days when I just would not be able to write anything of value, but I would just type out garbage. I mean, you know, I would just write for the sake of it. I would finish. So I had a certain quota that I wanted to do every day in terms of the words. So I would.
What was it?
Depending on the period, like, so for some days it was 400, 500. On some days it was about 600 to 800. Yeah, so it varied.
So flexible, but roughly.
Yeah. But I was sure that every single day I have to write at least something. So, and on some days I really would not be able to, you know, produce anything of value because I would just be too exhausted. But then I would still go ahead and write anyway. And then I realized it was extremely counterproductive because I would spend the next day just, you know, like eliminating it and just reworking it and, you know, then fixing it. Mm-hmm. But it was also very helpful because, you know, once I figured out, I mean, that part, you know, where I was really unable to move forward, where I had to just like write something. If I hadn't done that, then, I mean, it would have probably taken me a lot longer because it would have really drained, you know, my self-confidence. So I just like, you know, yeah, so while it was counterproductive in a way,
yeah,
it also helped to, move me along and just to keep me like, you know, there.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. Any parting advice to writers or you want to share about your upcoming projects?
Sure. So I think one piece of advice I would give is that do not write a book for the money, you know, because you will be disappointed. Just try and be very, very true to what you really want to do with the book. Because only write a book if you're completely serious, you know, about, and also if you're completely sold by the idea yourself. You know, because there is no point in getting into a book project if you're not completely serious. And do know that you will not get a lot of financial rewards for it. So I think you should really do the book because you really believe in it.
Yeah, the pursuit is the pleasure.
Exactly.
Yeah. This book that you've written is the book of the month for Network Capital.
Thank you
so we're going to
much.
be reading it together as a large global community.
Right.
And this podcast will go out to about 100,000 people. Thank you very much for your time. We truly appreciate it.
It was great being here.